The morning Victoria Adams felt her knees buckle beneath her while hauling water from the well, she knew her brother's cruelty had finally broken something fundamental inside her body. She caught herself on the wooden frame, splinters digging into her palm, while black spots danced across her vision like a swarm of flies descending on carrion. Through the haze, she could see Marcus standing on the porch of their weathered ranch house just outside Utica, Montana, watching her struggle with the bucket, his arms crossed over his chest, and that familiar expression of cold calculation etched across his face. It was June of 1882, and the summer sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty Montana landscape, making everything shimmer with heat that seemed to press down on her already weakened frame. Victoria was 19 years old, though she looked closer to 14 in her current state. Her dress, once fitted properly when their father was still alive, now hung off her shoulders like a scarecrow's garment, the fabric bunching around her middle, where she had tried to take it in with clumsy stitching. Her ribs protruded beneath the thin cotton, each one visible and countable, creating shadowed grooves along her torso that deepened with every labored breath. Her collarbones jutted out sharply, and her face had taken on a hollow, gaunt quality that made her blue eyes appear enormous and haunted. The townspeople who saw her on the rare occasions Marcus allowed her to accompany him into town would whisper behind their hands, their faces pinched with concern, but no one ever asked the questions that needed asking. Marcus had started restricting her meals 6 months after their father died from pneumonia that previous winter. At first it had seemed like simple penny pinching, the natural concern of a 24-year-old man suddenly responsible for a ranch and a younger sister. He would portion out smaller helpings at dinner, explaining that they needed to make their supplies last, that money was tight, that she needed to understand sacrifice. Victoria had accepted it without complaint, grieving their father too much to notice the slow, insidious progression of Marcus's control. But as weeks turned to months, the portions grew smaller still. Breakfast became a single piece of hard bread. Lunch disappeared entirely. Dinner was a thin soup with more water than substance, a few vegetables floating like lost ships in an ocean of nothing. When she had tried to sneak food from the pantry, Marcus had installed a lock. When she had attempted to cook something for herself, he had taken to carrying the key to the kitchen stores on a chain around his neck. He monitored everything she put in her mouth with the dedication of a prison warden, and if he caught her trying to circumvent his rules, he would reduce her rations even further. Victoria did not understand his motivation, could not comprehend what drove her brother to systematically starve her. There was no logical reason for it. The ranch was not wealthy, but neither were they destitute. They had chickens that laid eggs, a vegetable garden that produced adequately, cattle that could be sold. Marcus himself ate well, his frame remaining solid and strong while hers withered away. She suspected it had something to do with power, with the need to control something in a world that had taken their parents and left him with responsibilities he resented. Their mother had died when Victoria was only 7, succumbing to cholera during an outbreak that swept through Montana territory. Their father had raised them both as best he could, a stern but loving man who had taught Marcus ranching and given Victoria an education unusual for girls of the time. He had believed in her intelligence, had encouraged her to read, to think, to dream beyond the boundaries of their small ranch. Perhaps that was what Marcus could not forgive. Perhaps seeing her reminded him of their father's favoritism, real or imagined, or perhaps there was no reason at all, just a meanness in his spirit that their father's presence had kept in check and his death had allowed to flourish. Victoria finally managed to haul the water bucket up from the well, the rope burning her palms. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, erratic and fluttering like a trapped bird. The bucket sloshed, water spilling over the sides as her arms trembled with the effort of holding it. Marcus still had not moved from the porch. He simply watched, and in his watching was a silent challenge, a test she was forced to endure. She took one step, then another, her boots scuffing through the dirt. The distance between the well and the house could not have been more than 30 yards, but it stretched before her like an endless desert. She was halfway there when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the main road. A rider was coming up the path that led to their property, moving at an easy canter. Victoria did not look up, focusing all her energy on simply putting one foot in front of the other. The bucket grew heavier with each step, her arms screaming in protest. She could feel moisture on her upper lip, sweat, or possibly blood from where she had bitten the inside of her cheek to keep from crying out. The rider slowed as he approached, and through her peripheral vision, Victoria could make out a tall figure on a dappled gray horse. The man dismounted, with the fluid grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. She heard his boots hit the ground, heard the jingle of his spurs as he took a few steps closer. "Excuse me, miss," the stranger said, his voice carrying the distinctive drawl of someone raised in the territories. "You look like you could use some help with that." Victoria wanted to respond, wanted to assure him she was fine, but her throat was too dry and her concentration too focused on not dropping the bucket. She managed a small shake of her head, not in refusal, but in acknowledgement that she had heard him. The world had started to tilt again, the ground becoming less solid beneath her feet. "Marcus Adams, why?" the stranger called out, addressing her brother. "I am looking for the Adams Ranch. I was told you might have work available." Marcus finally moved, stepping down from the porch with measured steps. "Who is asking?" "Name is Caleb Orion," the man said. "I am a ranch hand, looking for seasonal work. Heard in town you might need an extra pair of hands with the cattle." Victoria risked a glance up at the newcomer. He was probably in his mid-20s, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that touched his collar beneath a worn Stetson. He had the lean, muscular build of a working cowboy, shoulders broad beneath a faded blue shirt, and there was something solid about his presence, something that suggested competence and quiet confidence. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, even in her weakened state. They were a warm hazel color, flecked with gold, and when they briefly met hers, she saw concern flash across his face before he quickly masked it. "Might be," Marcus said noncommittally. "Depends on your experience and what kind of wages you're expecting." Victoria forced herself to take another step. The bucket tilted dangerously, water sloshing onto her skirt, soaking through the thin fabric. Her vision was narrowing. Darkness creeping in from the edges. She could hear the two men talking, their voices seeming to come from very far away. Marcus was saying something about cattle drives and fence repairs. Caleb was responding, his tone even and professional. But the words had stopped making sense, becoming just sound without meaning. Her knees gave out entirely. The bucket fell from her hands, clattering against the ground and spilling water into the thirsty dirt. Victoria went down hard, her palms barely catching her before her face hit the earth. She knelt there, gasping, her whole body shaking with the effort of simply existing. "Jesus Christ," she heard Caleb say sharply. Then there were hands on her arms, strong and surprisingly gentle, helping her up. "Miss, are you all right?" Victoria could not answer. Her teeth were chattering despite the heat, and her limbs felt like they belonged to someone else, disconnected and useless. Caleb was supporting most of her weight, one arm around her back, and even through the layers of fog clouding her mind, she registered the shock in his voice when he felt how little of her there was beneath the dress. "She is fine," Marcus said coldly. "Just a bit of heat exhaustion. Victoria, get up and stop making a spectacle of yourself." "She does not look fine," Caleb shot back, and there was steel beneath the courtesy in his voice. "She looks like she has not eaten in a month. When was the last time this girl had a proper meal?" "That is none of your concern," Marcus said, his tone going dangerous. "That is my sister, and how I manage my household is my business." Caleb was quiet for a moment, and Victoria could feel the tension radiating through his body where he held her. She managed to open her eyes to focus on his face. He was looking at Marcus with an expression that was carefully blank, but his jaw was tight and a muscle jumped in his cheek, When he spoke again, his voice was deceptively calm. "I apologize. You're right. It is not my concern." He paused, then added, "About that work you might have available. I would be willing to work for low wages if it included room and board. I am a good cook, learned from a trail boss who had spent time working in a Denver hotel, could handle the cooking for the household in addition to the ranch work, if that would be useful." Marcus studied him for a long moment, calculation written across his features. Victoria knew what he was thinking. A ranch hand who would work cheaply and handle the cooking would free up time and money. It was an offer too good to refuse, regardless of whatever suspicions he might have about this stranger's motives. "Room and board plus $15 a month," Marcus said finally. "You bunk in the barn and handle morning and evening meals in addition to your ranch duties. You do not interfere in family matters, and if I tell you to do something, you do it without question." "Agreed," Caleb said without hesitation. "But I will need access to the kitchen and supplies to cook properly." Marcus nodded slowly. "Fine. Help her into the house and then put your horse in the barn. I will show you around the property." Caleb carefully guided Victoria toward the house, taking small steps to match her faltering pace. She wanted to tell him not to bother, that Marcus would just make things worse for her once the stranger was gone, but the words would not come. Her body had used up every reserve it had, and she was running on nothing but willpower, and even that was flickering like a candle in the wind. He got her through the door and to a chair in the kitchen, lowering her into it with a carefulness that spoke of experience handling fragile things. The kitchen was clean but sparse, the kind of cleanliness that came from lack of use rather than regular scrubbing. A large iron stove dominated one wall, and rough wooden shelves held a modest collection of dishes and cooking implements. Caleb grabbed a cup from the shelf, pumped water from the kitchen's hand pump, and brought it to her. "Drink," he said quietly, "in small sips." Victoria obeyed, her hands shaking so badly that he had to help her hold the cup. The water was cool and sweet, and it felt like the finest thing she had ever tasted. She drank slowly, as instructed, while Caleb watched her with those concerned hazel eyes. He did not say anything else, did not ask questions or make comments, but she could feel the anger radiating off him like heat from a stove. Marcus appeared in the doorway. "That is enough, Victoria. Go to your room and rest. Orion, come with me." Caleb straightened, giving Victoria one last look before following her brother out. She sat alone in the kitchen, still clutching the cup, and for the first time in months she felt something other than despair. It was a tiny spark, barely there, but it was something. Hope, perhaps, or just the simple knowledge that someone had seen her, truly seen her, and had not looked away. The rest of that day passed in a blur. Victoria retreated to her small bedroom, a cramped space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk containing her few possessions. She lay on top of the covers, too exhausted to do more than stare at the ceiling and listen to the sounds of the house. She could hear Marcus and Caleb talking outside, though not clearly enough to make out words. She heard Caleb moving his things into the barn, heard him in the kitchen later. The clatter of pots and pans, the sound of the stove being stoked. Smells began to drift through the house, rich and savory, making her stomach cramp with longing. When Marcus called her for dinner, she forced herself to rise and make her way to the kitchen. The table had been set with 3 places, and Caleb was just bringing over a large pot. He ladled stew into bowls, and Victoria's eyes widened at the portion he gave her. It was more food than she had seen in months, thick with chunks of beef, potatoes, carrots, and onions in a rich brown gravy. "This is too much," Marcus said sharply, gesturing at Victoria's bowl. "She does not need that much." "With respect, sir, she looks like she is half-starved," Caleb said evenly, meeting Marcus's gaze without flinching. "Part of my job is providing meals, and I take that seriously. A working household needs proper nutrition." "She does not do that much work," Marcus countered. "Then perhaps she could do more if she had the strength for it," Caleb replied. "Seems to me you would get more value out of having her healthy." It was a clever argument, appealing to Marcus's sense of practicality rather than any sense of compassion. Victoria watched her brother's face as he processed this, saw the moment he decided to allow it. not because he cared about her welfare, but because Caleb had framed it in terms of utility and value. "Fine," Marcus said tersely, "but you are not here to reform my household, Orion. You are here to work." "Yes, sir," Caleb said mildly, taking his own seat. That first meal was simultaneously the best and worst experience Victoria had endured in months. The food was delicious, properly seasoned and cooked with obvious skill, but her shrunken stomach rebelled after only a few bites, cramping painfully, and she had to force herself to eat slowly, to take tiny amounts and wait between each bite. Caleb noticed, of course. He seemed to notice everything, though he was subtle about it, never staring directly but always aware. When she had to stop, having eaten less than a quarter of the bowl, he did not comment. He simply cleared the dishes and mentioned that he would leave the pot on the stove in case anyone wanted more later. That night, after Marcus had retired to his room and the house had fallen silent, Victoria crept to the kitchen. The stove was still warm, and the pot was exactly where Caleb had left it. She ate another small portion, standing up in the dark, tears streaming down her face with a mixture of relief and disbelief. When she returned to her room, she slept more soundly than she had in half a year. Caleb established a pattern over the following days. He was up before dawn, starting breakfast before heading out to work on whatever tasks Marcus assigned him. Breakfast was substantial: eggs and bacon and fresh biscuits that melted in Victoria's mouth. He always served her portions that Marcus considered too large, and he always deflected her brother's objections with that same calm, practical logic. Lunch was sandwiches or leftovers, left on the kitchen table at midday. Dinner was hot and hearty, pot roasts and fried chicken and stews accompanied by vegetables from the garden that Caleb prepared in ways that made them actually appetizing. At first, Victoria could only manage small amounts at each meal, her stomach still too accustomed to deprivation. But Caleb was patient. He began leaving food where she could access it easily: an extra biscuit on the counter, a bowl of fruit on the table, cold meat wrapped in cloth in the cooler box. Never obvious, never in ways that Marcus would notice and object to, but always there. And slowly, day by day, Victoria began to eat more. The constant gnawing hunger that had become her normal state started to recede. The dizzy spells grew less frequent. The trembling in her hands began to steady. Marcus was not blind to what was happening, but Caleb had positioned himself as too valuable to easily dismiss. He worked harder than any ranch hand Marcus had employed before, fixing fences, tending cattle, mucking stables, handling any task assigned to him with efficiency and skill. He was up before Marcus and often still working after her brother had gone to bed. The ranch, which had been slowly falling into disrepair under Marcus's sole management, was beginning to function smoothly again. And Caleb never openly challenged Marcus's authority, never argued or refused an order. He simply made food, ensured Victoria had access to it, and went about his work. But Victoria noticed the small acts of kindness that went beyond just feeding her. Caleb would handle the heavier chores when Marcus was not looking, hauling water, carrying supplies, doing the tasks that had been crushing her under their weight. He would engage Marcus in conversation, distracting him during meals so Victoria could eat without her brother's hostile scrutiny. He spoke to her gently when they passed each other in the yard or the house, simple comments about the weather or the animals, treating her like a person rather than a burden or a problem to be managed. 3 weeks after Caleb arrived, Victoria was able to finish a full meal for the first time. She sat at the table with her empty bowl in front of her, stunned at the accomplishment. Caleb caught her eye from across the table and gave her the briefest smile, warm and encouraging, before turning his attention back to whatever Marcus was saying about the cattle. That night, Victoria looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand and saw that her face had filled out slightly, the sharp angles of her cheekbones softening, her eyes not quite so sunken. She touched her ribs, finding that they no longer protruded quite as starkly, a thin layer of flesh beginning to pad them. She was blooming, she realized, like a plant that had been dying from drought and was finally receiving water. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Color was returning to her skin, replacing the sallow grayness. Her hair, which had grown brittle and dull, was regaining some of its luster. She had always been slender, but now she was beginning to look healthy rather than skeletal. And with the physical improvement came a returning strength, not just in her body, but in her spirit. The fog of despair that had enveloped her for months was lifting, allowing her to think more clearly, to feel things beyond constant exhaustion and fear. It was during the 4th week that Victoria finally had a real conversation with Caleb. Marcus had ridden into Utica to conduct some business, a trip that would take most of the day. Victoria was in the garden weeding the vegetable beds when Caleb approached. He had been working on the fence along the north pasture, and his shirt was damp with sweat, dust coating his arms and face. "Miss Adams, honey," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I was going to pump some water from the well. Can I bring you any?" "Yes, please," Victoria said, sitting back on her heels. "And you do not need to be so formal. My name is Victoria." "Caleb," he replied, then added, "though you already know that." He walked to the well and returned a few minutes later with 2 full cups. He handed one to Victoria and drank deeply from his own, then refilled it. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, yet the only sounds the buzzing of insects and the distant lowing of cattle. "Thank you," Victoria said quietly, "for everything. I know what you have been doing." Caleb looked at her, his hazel eyes serious. "I have just been cooking meals." "You have been saving my life," Victoria corrected, "and I need you to know how grateful I am, even if I cannot properly express it." He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as if he was deciding whether to speak. Finally he said, "What happened to you? Why would your brother do that?" Victoria shook her head helplessly. "I do not know. After our father died, Marcus just started getting meaner, controlling. At first I thought it was grief or stress, but then it became clear that he was doing it deliberately, that he wanted me weak and dependent." She paused, then added, "I think part of him wants me to just disappear, to die maybe, or run away. Then he would have the ranch to himself, no reminders of our father or the past." "You could leave," Caleb said carefully. "You are 19, old enough to make your own choices. There are opportunities for women in the cities, work as seamstresses or teachers or domestic help." "With what resources?" Victoria asked bitterly. "I have no money. Marcus controls everything, and look at me. I am only just now strong enough to work in a garden without collapsing. How would I get to a city? How would I survive the journey?" She shook her head again. "I have thought about it, believe me, but every plan falls apart when I consider the practicalities." Caleb nodded slowly, understanding crossing his features. "Then we will just have to make sure you keep getting stronger. And in the meantime, I will do what I can to keep you fed and safe." "He will notice eventually," Victoria warned. "He will see that I'm gaining weight, getting healthier, and he will do something to stop it." "Let me worry about that," Caleb said. "Your job is to eat, rest, and heal. Can you do that?" Victoria looked at him, at this stranger who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had been too exhausted to voice. "Why are you doing this? You do not know me. This is not your problem." "Because it is the right thing to do," Caleb said simply, "and because no one deserves to be treated the way you have been treated. Your brother is a cruel man, and someone needs to stand between you and that cruelty." He paused, then added with a hint of humor, "Besides, you are an excellent audience for my cooking. It is satisfying to feed someone who appreciates it." Despite everything, Victoria laughed. It was a rusty sound, unpracticed, but genuine. Caleb grinned in response, and for just a moment the weight of her circumstances felt lighter. They worked in the garden together for the next hour, Caleb helping her with the heavier tasks while they talked about inconsequential things. He told her about his life as a ranch hand, moving from place to place across Montana and Wyoming, working seasonal jobs and cattle drives. He spoke of seeing the land change with the seasons, of nights spent under stars so thick they looked like spilled salt, of the satisfaction that came from hard physical work. Victoria found herself sharing memories of her father, stories she had not told anyone since his death. recollections of his patient teaching and quiet affection. It was the beginning of something, a friendship, or perhaps the seeds of something deeper, though neither of them acknowledged it yet. They were two people who had found each other by chance in difficult circumstances, and for now that was enough. Marcus returned from town in a foul mood, and the temperature in the house dropped accordingly. He was sharp with both of them at dinner, criticizing the food and complaining about various ranchers in town who he felt had slighted him. Caleb absorbed it all with unruffled calm, answering respectfully when required and remaining silent otherwise. Victoria kept her eyes on her plate, making herself small and unnoticeable, a survival skill she had perfected over months. But that night, after the house was dark, she heard a soft tap on her window. She opened it to find Caleb standing outside, barely visible in the moonlight. "I am bunking in the barn," he said quietly. "But if you ever need help, if Marcus does something or you are in danger, you throw something against the barn wall. A rock, a shoe, whatever you can find. I am a light sleeper. I will hear it and come. Understand?" Victoria nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you." "Get some sleep," Caleb said. "You are doing good, Victoria. You are getting stronger every day." He disappeared into the darkness, and Victoria closed the window, touched by his concern. She did throw something against the barn wall that night, but it was because Marcus had come into her room after midnight, standing over her bed in the darkness. She had pretended to be asleep, her heart hammering in her chest, terrified of what he might do. He had just stood there for what felt like an eternity before finally leaving, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The rock she threw hit the barn wall with a solid thunk, and within minutes Caleb was at her door. She let him in, whispering what had happened, and the expression that crossed his face was dangerous. "Did he touch you?" Caleb asked, his voice low and controlled. "No, he just stood there, watching me sleep." Victoria wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warm summer night. It was like he was trying to decide something. "That is going to stop," Caleb said firmly. "Tomorrow I'm going to fix that lock on your door so it can be secured from the inside. I will tell Marcus it is for security, in case anyone breaks into the house. He will not argue with that logic." "He will know it is to keep him out," Victoria said. "I do not particularly care what he knows," Caleb replied. "You need to be able to sleep safely. This is not negotiable." He was true to his word. The next day, he repaired and reinforced Victoria's door lock, installing a sturdy bolt that could only be opened from inside the room. Marcus watched the work with narrowed eyes, but said nothing, perhaps sensing that pushing back would reveal motives he preferred to keep hidden. That night, Victoria slid the bolt home and slept deeply, the security of the locked door allowing her to truly rest. Summer progressed, and with it, Victoria's recovery continued. By the end of July, she had regained a healthy weight, her body filling out to a normal, robust size. She could work all day without exhaustion, could haul water and tend the garden and help with the cooking. Her face had become pretty again. The bone structure that starvation had made sharp now softened with flesh, her blue eyes bright and alert. She braided her honey blonde hair each morning, and it shone in the sunlight, thick and healthy. Caleb watched her transformation with obvious satisfaction, though he was careful to keep his admiration respectful. But Victoria was not blind to the way his eyes lingered on her sometimes, or the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to her. And she was not blind to her own growing feelings, the way her heart would lift when she heard his voice, the way she looked forward to their brief moments of conversation, the security she felt knowing he was nearby. They were falling in love, slowly and inevitably, like two stars drawn together by gravity. Neither spoke of it directly. The situation was too complicated, too fraught with potential disaster, but it was there in every shared glance, every casual touch, every smile exchanged across the dinner table when Marcus was not looking. Marcus, of course, noticed. He was not stupid, just cruel, and he saw the way Victoria had blossomed, the way she carried herself with increasing confidence, the warmth between her and the ranch hand. His control was slipping, and he resented it bitterly. He began finding excuses to send Caleb away from the house, assigning him tasks that kept him out on the range for days at a time, checking on distant pastures or repairing fence lines in far corners of the property. During Caleb's absences, Marcus would reinstate his old patterns, locking the pantry, limiting Victoria's access to food. But she was stronger now, better able to withstand the deprivation for a few days, and Caleb had taught her how to preserve and hide food. She kept supplies in her room, dried meat and preserved fruit and hardtack, enough to sustain her until Caleb returned. And he always returned, his face tightening when he saw the evidence of Marcus's renewed cruelty, preparing extra rich meals to help Victoria recover from the days of reduced rations. It came to a head in mid-August. Marcus had sent Caleb to drive a small group of cattle to a neighboring ranch, a task that should have taken 3 days. But Caleb had completed it in 2, returning a day early to find Victoria in the kitchen, her face bruised and her lips split. Marcus had hit her, something he had never done before, his frustration boiling over into violence when she had dared to question why he was locking up the food again. Caleb went very still when he saw her, a dangerous kind of stillness like a predator before it strikes. "Where is he?" "In town," Victoria said, dabbing at her split lip with a cloth. "He left an hour ago." Caleb crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, gently tilting her face to examine the bruising. His hands were shaking slightly with rage or fear she could not tell. "Did he do anything else? Hurt you anywhere else?" "No, just this," Victoria assured him. "I am all right, Caleb. It looks worse than it is." "It is not all right," Caleb said, his voice rough. "None of this is all right. I cannot stand by and watch this anymore, Victoria. I cannot keep pretending that working here and cooking meals is enough. He is escalating and it is going to get worse." "What can we do?" Victoria asked helplessly. "He owns this ranch. He is my legal guardian until I turn 21. The law is on his side." "Then we leave," Caleb said, "both of us. Tonight, before he gets back. I have money saved enough to get us to Helena or Virginia City. You can find work, or we can figure something else out, but we get you away from him." Victoria stared at him, hope and fear warring in her chest. "He will come after us. He will not let me go that easily." "I know," Caleb said grimly. "But once we are away from here, once you are somewhere with witnesses and people around, he cannot do anything. And I will be with you. I will not let him hurt you again." "Why?" Victoria whispered. "Why would you risk so much for me?" Caleb looked at her for a long moment, his hazel eyes intense. "Because I love you. I have loved you since that first day when you fell in the yard and I caught you, all bone and determination. I have loved you watching you fight to survive, to heal, to become strong again. And I will not stand by and watch your brother destroy you when I have the power to prevent it." Victoria felt tears spill down her cheeks, hot and overwhelming. "I love you too. I have been too afraid to say it, too afraid to even think it, but I do. You saved my life, Caleb, in every way that matters." He pulled her into his arms, careful of her injuries, and she buried her face in his chest. He smelled of dust and horses and sweat, of hard work and the open range, and it was the most comforting scent she had ever encountered. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other, acknowledging what they had both been denying for weeks. "We will pack light," Caleb said finally, pulling back enough to look at her. "Only what you need. Clothes, any documents you have, anything with sentimental value that is small enough to carry. We will take 2 horses and leave within the hour. With luck, we will have a half-day's head start before Marcus realizes we are gone." They moved with focused efficiency. Victoria gathered her few possessions, her mother's locket, her father's Bible, a daguerreotype of her parents from before she was born. She changed into her most practical dress, one meant for riding, and packed another along with undergarments and a warm shawl. Caleb had even fewer possessions, his life as an itinerant ranch hand having taught him to travel light. He saddled his gray horse and another mount, a steady bay mare, loading saddlebags with food and supplies. They left Utica as the sun was beginning to set, heading east toward the mountains. Caleb knew the territory well, knew trails that avoided the main roads, routes that would make them harder to track. They rode through the evening and into the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses, pushing on with grim determination. Victoria's face ached and exhaustion pulled at her, but she did not complain. Freedom had a taste to it, sharp and exhilarating, and she would endure any hardship to keep it. They made camp in a dense grove of pines as dawn was breaking, too tired to go further. Caleb built a small fire and heated coffee, strong and black, and they ate cold biscuits left over from Victoria's hidden supplies. In the growing light, Victoria could see the lines of fatigue on Caleb's face, the worry he was trying to hide. "Do you think he will follow us?" she asked. "Yes," Caleb said honestly, "but he will have to find us first, and we have a good lead. By the time he realizes we are gone and figures out which direction we went, we will be in Helena. Once we are there, surrounded by people and law enforcement, it will be much harder for him to do anything." "What will we do in Helena?" Victoria asked. "How will we live?" "I can always find work as a ranch hand or laborer," Caleb said, "and you are educated. You could teach or work as a clerk. We will figure it out, Victoria. Together." She reached across the small fire and took his hand. "Together," she repeated, the word feeling like a promise. They slept in shifts, one keeping watch while the other rested, though the forest remained quiet except for bird calls and the whisper of wind through the pines. When they set out again that afternoon, Victoria felt renewed despite her lack of sleep, energized by hope and the man riding beside her. They traveled for 3 more days, moving steadily eastward, avoiding towns and settlements where Marcus might make inquiries. Caleb hunted small game to supplement their supplies, and they camped in secluded spots, always careful to leave no obvious traces of their passage. The journey was hard, but Victoria found herself enjoying aspects of it despite the circumstances. There was a freedom in being on the move, in sleeping under the stars, in the simplicity of each day's goal being merely to cover more distance. And there was the deepening connection between her and Caleb, the easy companionship that came from shared purpose and mutual trust. On the 4th night, camped beside a small creek in a mountain valley, Caleb asked Victoria to marry him. There was no ring, no formal proposal, just the two of them sitting by the fire, shoulders touching, watching sparks drift upward into the darkness. "When we get to Helena," he said quietly, "I would like to find a preacher and make this official. Make you my wife, if you will have me. I know it is fast, and I know we have not courted properly, but I do not want there to be any question about your status or any legal ambiguity that Marcus could exploit." "Yes," Victoria said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you. I want nothing more." He kissed her then, gentle and careful, mindful of her still healing lip. It was Victoria's first kiss, and it felt like coming home, like finding something she had been searching for without knowing she was looking. When they pulled apart, both were smiling, the firelight dancing across their faces. They reached Helena on a bright afternoon in late August, the city sprawling across a mountainside, buildings of wood and brick climbing the slopes in haphazard terraces. Helena was a mining town that had grown into something more, booming with the wealth pulled from the surrounding mountains. The streets bustled with activity. Miners and merchants and families, freight wagons and stagecoaches clattering over the dirt roads. It was noisy and chaotic and beautiful in its vitality. Caleb led them to a modest boarding house on the outskirts of town, where he negotiated a week's stay with the proprietor, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Fletcher. She looked at Victoria's bruised face and the way she and Caleb rode together and asked no questions, simply showing them to a small but clean room with 2 narrow beds. "We will find a preacher tomorrow," Caleb said after Mrs. Fletcher had left them alone. "And then I will start looking for work. There are several large ranches in the area, and the mines always need laborers." But before they could do any of that, Marcus found them. He arrived in Helena 2 days after they did, tracking them through a combination of determination and luck. He appeared at the boarding house in the evening, pounding on the door of their room with enough force to rattle the frame. "Victoria!" he shouted. "I know you are in there! Open this door!" Caleb stepped in front of Victoria, his posture protective. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. Then, louder, addressing Marcus through the door, "She does not want to see you. Leave now before I call the sheriff." "She is my sister," Marcus snarled, "and she is coming home with me. You have no right to take her." "I am not going anywhere with you," Victoria called out, her voice shaking but firm. "You starved me, Marcus. You abused me. I will not go back to that." The door shuddered under a heavy impact, Marcus throwing his weight against it. But the lock held, and before he could try again, they heard other voices in the hallway, other boarders responding to the commotion. Mrs. Fletcher's voice rang out, sharp and authoritative. "Sir, you stop that immediately, or I will fetch the law. This is a respectable establishment, and I will not have brawling." There was a moment of tense silence. Then they heard Marcus's retreating footsteps stomping down the hallway and out of the building. But Victoria knew her brother, knew his stubbornness and his vindictiveness. He would not give up that easily. "We need to get married as soon as possible," Caleb said, "tomorrow morning. Once you are my legal wife, Marcus's claim as your guardian becomes void. He will have no legal standing to take you anywhere." They found a circuit preacher the next day, a weathered old man with kind eyes who asked no uncomfortable questions about the speed of their courtship. The ceremony was simple, performed in the small church with Mrs. Fletcher and another boarding house resident serving as witnesses. Victoria wore her best dress, carefully mended and cleaned, and Caleb had purchased a simple gold band from a jeweler that morning. They spoke their vows with hands clasped, both meaning every word, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Victoria felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. They registered the marriage with the county clerk that afternoon, obtaining an official certificate. Caleb held it carefully as they walked back to the boarding house, this piece of paper that represented security and legitimacy in a future they had claimed for themselves. Marcus made one more attempt that evening. Arriving with a local deputy, he had clearly fed some fabricated story to about his sister being abducted. But Caleb calmly produced the marriage certificate, and Victoria stepped forward and stated clearly in front of witnesses that she had married of her own free will, that she was of legal age to do so, and that her husband had never abducted or coerced her. The deputy, seeing the bruises still visible on Victoria's face and clearly doing the math about where they had come from, informed Marcus that there was nothing to be done and that he should leave the newlyweds alone. Marcus stood on the boarding house steps, his face mottled with rage and frustration. "You will regret this," he spat at Victoria. "Both of you. That ranch should be mine by rights, and you have stolen it." "The ranch was never just yours," Victoria said quietly. "Father left it to both of us, and you forfeited any claim to partnership when you decided to starve me. I want nothing from you, Marcus. Not the ranch, not the land, nothing. Just leave us alone." "You cannot disinherit me," Marcus said, grasping at straws. "The property is joint ownership. You will have to buy me out if you want it." "Keep it," Victoria said. "I do not want it. Consider it payment for all the meals you denied me. Raise your cattle, live your life, but stay away from us." She turned and walked back into the boarding house, Caleb at her side, leaving Marcus standing alone on the steps. They never saw him again. Years later, they would hear through travelers and newspapers that Marcus had eventually sold the ranch and moved to Oregon Territory, but by then it did not matter. He had become part of a past they had left behind. Caleb found work with a large ranching operation north of Helena, hired on as a senior ranch hand with the promise of advancement. The wages were good and the work was steady. They rented a small house in town, nothing fancy but clean and comfortable, with 2 rooms and a kitchen and a front porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the mountains. Victoria took work as a seamstress, her neat stitching and attention to detail earning her a steady stream of clients among Helena's growing middle class. Their life together developed a comfortable rhythm. Caleb would rise before dawn and ride out to the ranch, returning in the evening dirty and tired, but always with a smile for Victoria. She would have dinner waiting, and they would eat together, talking about their days, making plans for the future. At night, they would lie in their narrow bed, wrapped in each other's arms, and Victoria would marvel at the change in her circumstances. A year ago, she had been dying slowly in her brother's house, trapped and helpless. Now she was healthy, happy, loved, and free. Winter came to Montana with characteristic harshness, snow piling high, and temperatures dropping far below freezing. But their little house was warm, the stove well-fed, and the walls tight against drafts. Caleb would come home covered in snow, and Victoria would help him out of his frozen coat and boots, serving him hot coffee and stew while he thawed. They were poor by many standards, but they did not feel poor. They had each other. They had enough, and that was sufficient. In the spring, Victoria discovered she was pregnant. The realization came with a mixture of joy and fear. She had seen women die in childbirth, knew the risks, but Caleb's excitement was infectious. He was tender and attentive throughout the pregnancy, insisting Victoria reduce her work, taking on extra jobs to make up for the lost income. He would place his hand on her growing belly and talk to the baby, telling stories about the ranch and the mountains, making plans for teaching their child to ride and rope. Their son was born in November of 1883, arriving during an early snowstorm with a lusty cry that proclaimed his health and vigor. They named him William Thomas Orion, after Caleb's father and Victoria's father, respectively. He was a beautiful baby, robust and strong, with his mother's blue eyes and his father's dark hair. Caleb wept when he held him for the first time, overcome with emotion, and Victoria knew that her husband was thinking of the family he had never had, the stability and love that had been absent from his own itinerant childhood. William thrived, growing into a boisterous toddler who kept Victoria constantly busy. Caleb would play with him in the evenings, tossing him in the air and letting him ride on his shoulders, filling their small house with laughter. They were happy in a way that felt almost too good to be true, as if the universe might notice and decide to correct the imbalance. But the happiness held. When William was 2, Caleb was promoted to foreman of the ranch where he worked, a position that came with increased responsibility and significantly better wages. They were able to move to a larger house, one with 3 bedrooms and a proper dining room, and to save money for the first time in their lives. Victoria stopped taking in sewing, focusing instead on raising William and managing their household. She planted a large garden, kept chickens, and learned to preserve food in abundance, the instincts born from her time of starvation now channeled into ensuring her family would always have plenty. A daughter arrived in 1886, a delicate little girl they named Clara May. She was quieter than William had been, observant and thoughtful even as an infant. Victoria loved having a daughter, teaching her songs and taking her on walks, marveling at the tiny, perfect features and the trust in those infant eyes. Caleb was equally smitten, this strong, rough cowboy reduced to foolish smiles and baby talk by his little girl. Life continued its forward momentum. William started school, bright and curious, already reading at a level beyond his years. Clara grew into a sweet-natured child, helpful and kind. Caleb continued to advance in his career, becoming a partner in the ranching operation by 1890. His hard work and skill finally translating into ownership and real prosperity. They were able to purchase land of their own, a modest spread north of Helena with good grazing and a solid house. It was not a large ranch, but it was theirs, bought with money they had earned through their own labor. Victoria would sometimes stand on the porch of their ranch house, looking out over the land they owned, and think about that day in June of 1882 when she had collapsed in the yard of her brother's ranch. The girl she had been then felt like a different person, someone from a story rather than her own past. That girl had been starving, broken, without hope. This woman, this Victoria Orion, was healthy and loved and free. She had a husband who cherished her, children who thrived, and a life that brought her joy. Caleb would often come up behind her during these moments of reflection, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about, what?" he would ask. "About how far we have come," Victoria would reply. "About how grateful I am that you rode up that day and saw me, truly saw me, and decided to help." "I am the grateful one," Caleb would always respond. "You gave me a family, Victoria, a reason to stay in one place, a home. Before you, I was just drifting, working jobs and moving on. You gave me purpose." They would stand like that, watching their children play in the yard, watching the sun set over the mountains they had crossed together years before. And Victoria would think about blooming, about what it meant to be fed not just with food, but with love and respect and care. Her brother had tried to make her disappear, to reduce her to nothing through deprivation and cruelty. But Caleb had fed her day after day, meal after meal, until she had not just survived, but flourished. In 1892, when Victoria was 29 and Caleb 33, they decided to have one more child. A second son arrived that fall, whom they named James Marcus. The middle name was Victoria's choice, an acknowledgement of her past and a reclaiming of it. Marcus had been a cruel brother, but he had also inadvertently brought her and Caleb together. Without his cruelty, they might never have met. It was a complicated legacy, but Victoria had learned that life was complicated, that pain and joy could be intertwined in unexpected ways. Their ranch prospered over the years. Caleb was an excellent cattleman, and Victoria proved to have a head for business, managing their finances and making smart investments. They expanded slowly and carefully, never overextending, building something sustainable that they could pass on to their children. William showed aptitude for ranching, working alongside his father from a young age. Clara displayed artistic talent, filling sketchbooks with drawings of the Montana landscape. James was still too young to show clear interests, but he was bright and curious, trailing after his older siblings and asking endless questions. By the turn of the century, the Orion Ranch was one of the most respected operations in the Helena area. They employed several ranch hands, treating them well and paying fair wages, remembering what it was like to be on the other side of that relationship. Victoria became known in the community for her charity work, quietly helping families in need, ensuring no child went hungry if she could prevent it. She never spoke about her own past, but Caleb sometimes wondered if people guessed, if they looked at her fierce dedication to feeding the hungry and understood that it came from personal experience. Their marriage remained strong through the years. They had their disagreements, certainly, the normal frictions of two people building a life together, but the foundation of respect and love and shared history was unshakable. Caleb still looked at Victoria with the same warmth in his hazel eyes that he had shown that first day. And Victoria still felt her heart lift when she heard his footsteps on the porch, still felt safe and cherished in his presence. As their children grew into young adults, Victoria and Caleb began to talk about retirement, about eventually turning the ranch over to William and his future family. Clara had announced her intention to move to San Francisco to study art, a plan that terrified and excited her parents in equal measure. James was still finding his way, but at 9 years old there was plenty of time. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1903, Caleb took Victoria to the spot where they had first camped when fleeing from Marcus, the pine grove in the mountain valley. It took some searching to find it, as the land had changed over 2 decades, but they eventually located the creek and the clearing. They spread a blanket and unpacked a picnic, sitting in the dappled sunshine, and remembered. "Do you ever regret it?" Victoria asked, echoing a conversation they had in this very spot years before. "Leaving that job at Marcus's ranch, taking on a starving woman and her problems, changing your whole life?" "Not for one single moment," Caleb said firmly. "You were never a problem, Victoria. You were the answer. to questions I did not even know I was asking about what I wanted from life and who I wanted to be. I was so scared, Victoria admitted. When we left, when we were running, I kept thinking that somehow it would all fall apart, that you would realize what a burden I was, or Marcus would catch us, or we would not be able to make it work. I could not believe that happiness was actually possible. But it was, Caleb said softly. It is. We made it possible together. Victoria leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. You fed me until I bloomed, she said, not just with food, though that was how it started, but with kindness, with respect, with love. You nourished me in every way that matters. We fed each other, Caleb corrected. You gave me just as much as I gave you. A home, a family, a purpose. We grew together. They sat in the mountain valley until the sun began to set, then packed up and rode back to their ranch, to the life they had built from desperation and determination and love. Their children were waiting when they returned. William, with a new foal he wanted to show his father, Clara with sketches to display, James with 1,000 questions about the stars he had observed the night before. The house was warm and full of life, and there was plenty of food on the table, always plenty. Victoria lived to be 73, passing peacefully in her sleep in 1936. By then she had 7 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren, a legacy that would extend forward in time, carrying pieces of her strength and resilience. Caleb followed her 18 months later, as if unable to bear an extended separation from the woman who had been his partner for more than half a century. They were buried side by side in the Helena Cemetery, their shared headstone simple but elegant, marking the resting place of 2 people who had found each other against the odds and built something beautiful from unpromising materials. Their story became part of family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren. The details would blur over time, becoming less sharp, but the essential truth remained. Victoria had been starving and broken, and Caleb had fed her until she bloomed. Together they had escaped cruelty and built a life based on kindness, respect, and love. It was a simple story, really, but it was theirs. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. William took over the ranch and ran it successfully for decades, marrying a school teacher from Helena and raising 5 children of his own. Clara became a respected artist in San Francisco, her paintings of Montana landscapes hanging in galleries across the West. James became a veterinarian, applying his curiosity and love of animals to a profession that served his community. All of them carried forward the lessons their parents had taught them about resilience, about the importance of feeding others in whatever way they needed nourishment, about building rather than tearing down. The Adams Ranch, the place where Victoria had nearly died, was eventually sold by Marcus to a family who had no knowledge of its dark history. The house was torn down in the 1920s, replaced by a more modern structure, and the land was absorbed into a larger operation. No physical trace remained of that June day in 1882 when a starving girl collapsed in the yard and a cowboy on a gray horse decided to intervene. But the consequences of that moment rippled forward through time, affecting dozens of lives, creating a family that would not otherwise have existed. In later years, Victoria's grandchildren would ask her about the faint scars on her wrists, the places where bones had once pressed too sharply against skin. She would tell them that they were reminders of a difficult time, but also of the healing that followed. She would speak of their grandfather with deep affection, describing his kindness, his strength, his patient dedication to her recovery. She never spoke much about Marcus, about the brother who had tried to erase her. He did not deserve space in the story of her life, except as the darkness that made Caleb's light more brilliant by contrast. And when the grandchildren asked how she survived, how she found the strength to keep going during those months of starvation, Victoria would think carefully before answering. I survived because I had to, she would say, because giving up would have meant Marcus won. But I did more than survive once your grandfather found me. I thrived, I bloomed, because he gave me not just food, but hope, and hope is the most nourishing thing a person can receive. The youngest grandchild once asked Victoria what her favorite meal was, expecting perhaps a description of some elaborate feast. But Victoria had smiled and said, "The first bowl of stew your grandfather ever made me. It was simple, just beef and vegetables and gravy, but it was the best thing I ever tasted because it represented caring. It represented someone seeing that I was hungry and choosing to feed me. Every meal after that was good, but that first one was transcendent because it meant I was no longer alone." The Orion Ranch continued to operate well into the 20th century, adapting to changing times but maintaining the core values Caleb and Victoria had instilled. It became known as a place that treated its workers well, where fair pay and respect were givens. The family had a reputation for charity and community involvement, for being people who could be relied upon in hard times. That reputation was Victoria's true legacy. The way she had transformed her own suffering into a determination that others would not suffer if she could prevent it. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the family gathered, they would sometimes tell the story again. How Victoria's brother had starved her until her ribs showed through, until she was more ghost than girl. How the cowboy had fed her every day until she bloomed, until she was strong and healthy and whole. How they had fallen in love and built a life together, how they had raised children and prospered and grown old side by side. It was a love story, yes, but it was also a survival story. A story about resilience and recovery, about the transformative power of consistent kindness. And it was a story with a happy ending, the kind Victoria had barely dared to dream of during those dark months when every day was a struggle simply to exist. She got her happy ending, earned it through strength and courage, found it in the arms of a man who saw her worth when she could barely see it herself. They bloomed together, Victoria and Caleb, nourishing each other through decades of partnership, creating beauty and love from circumstances that should have destroyed them. That was the true miracle, not the initial rescue, but the sustained commitment to choosing each other day after day, year after year, through whatever challenges arose. Their story ended, as all stories do, with death and grief and the passage of time, but it also continued in the lives they had touched, the children and grandchildren who carried forward their values, the community that remembered them fondly, the land that still bore the marks of their stewardship. Victoria bloomed, and in blooming, she seeded future gardens, creating life and hope that extended far beyond her own span of years. And that perhaps was the best ending of all. The knowledge that their love had not been contained to just two people but had spread outward, affecting the world in small but meaningful ways. The cowboy fed her and she bloomed, and together they created something worth remembering. That was the story. That was enough.